Labor is seeking to pass its housing bill in the Senate this week. In fact, it's reintroduced it today. This is after the Greens and Coalition blocked legislation prior to the winter break. But the Albanese government is hoping that the Greens might just blink here. The government's goodwill, though, could be undone if amendments to the proposed thin capitalisation bill is ignored. Joining me live is Mike Zorbas, the CEO of the Property Council of Australia. Thanks so much for your time, Mike. You've been concerned about this for some time. Why?
Well, given the housing crisis, Laura, given the 500,000 people coming into the country, the Property Council will back any government initiative committed to closing the housing supply deficit. We back the Housing Australia Future Fund, we back the $2 billion for social and affordable homes, and we've welcomed the improvements to build-to-rent investment announced in the last budget, and those are specifically about addressing this supply crisis that you were speaking of. Those initiatives, and that particular one about build-to-rent risks being undone by a piece of legislation whose general objectives we back. We back the second reading speech. These were limited to integrity measures to prevent base erosion, but the bill, unfortunately, stumbles well beyond its original stated integrity intention. And what's basically happening is the legislative changes as they've been put risk investment in about 20,000 build-to-rent apartments currently in planning, and they could also ultimately jeopardise about 150,000 of those build-to-rent homes over the next decade.
Why is that? Is that because it limits the amount of investment and essentially locks out foreign investors?
Yeah, the viability of those projects in the Australian property sector rely very heavily on the involvement of third-party capital. So under the proposed legislation, the property industry would not have access to traditional third-party debt deductions, which are a pillar of the property trust financing structure and have been for many decades in this country. In fact, we have one of the leading trust frameworks in the entire world. Without that money, those thousands of much-needed housing projects simply won't go ahead with any certainty.
Okay, so you're calling on amendments, simple amendments that could actually change all of this?
Yeah, no, I mean, good question. Like, as currently drafted, the significant disadvantage to Australian property trusts is actually a global one. So in the US and the UK, they actually carve out institutional property trusts from similar regimes, acknowledging as our regime should, in fact, that the institutional property sector does not pose a genuine risk of profit sharing of the kind that the bill is in general trying to address. So the amendments to the bill can easily be made, and they should be made now, so that the bill does three things. One, it needs to appropriately address integrity risks, of which there is no evidence in institutional property that that's been a problem. Two, it needs to facilitate those standard commercial lending arrangements that I was talking about in the property sector. And three, it needs to avoid the worsening housing affordability crisis. And let me be very clear here. When the government is about to score an own goal on their own housing targets, the Property Council is always going to point that out. If these thin cap changes are unamended in the next few weeks, the government can wave goodbye to the 1 million well-located homes that it's aiming to have in place by 2029.
All right, that's a fair warning there from you, Mike Zorbas. What has the government said to you privately? I don't want you to, give away any confidences, but are they attuned now? Are they very aware of the risks that you're talking about? And what about the crossbench? Because there's a lot of teal independents here that, especially along the east coast of New South Wales and in Sydney in particular, where housing is an acute problem.
Look, you're right, Laura. I think the government are listening intently. We've certainly had very respectful dialogue with them and the Treasury over an 8-month period. It is a very complicated area of international investment, but that doesn't make it any less vital. And just because some of these aspects of the legislation are very obscure doesn't mean they shouldn't be got right. So we are talking to government at all levels. We are talking to the crossbench in both houses, of course. This is a vital period of time for Australia to get things right on the housing front. We really do have an unacceptable level of housing supply deficit for a nation that is so wealthy in land and prosperous in a general economic sense. We've really got to close that gap, and this is one of the ways through build-to-rent housing, institutional investment from overseas, that we have both built our cities over the last couple of decades and the way in which we can close that housing supply deficit.
Mike, before I let you go, I mean, this is a really hot political topic at the moment. People seeing rents soaring. Investors have invested with an assumption of a set of rules. We've seen, mortgages, and there's a hell of a lot of people about to fall off that mortgage cliff for their fixed rates comes off as well. This is all playing into what's going on in the housing market. There's things being talked about like rent control, limiting the number of Airbnbs that can be in any one area. What do you think about those arguments?
Let me be quite plain here. Rent control is a sort of toxic magic pudding. It sounds like it's going to do something beneficial for housing supply, but it really actually mitigates against new housing supply, because what you're doing is you're taxing the supply of new homes. You're driving investors in new homes out of the market effectively, and that will make it a lot harder to get projects, whether they're detached housing or apartments, out of the ground. So rent capping is the course you would pursue if you wanted to diminish the supply of housing across the country in the medium and long term. And I don't think any serious government decision makers honestly want to do that. The only way that we can fix housing supply in this country is to improve broken state planning systems, to set legitimate housing targets across the country, and then to stick to those very rigidly and make all parliaments account for the number of homes that are being created as social infrastructure around the nation, whether that's at-market homes, whether that's social homes, whether that's key worker homes. All of these categories of the housing spectrum need to be addressed at a holistic level. And I think, generally speaking, that's what the government's trying to do through the Housing Accord. They've just got to stay the path and not be distracted by red herrings. Rent capping doesn't work. It doesn't work overseas. It doesn't work in the ACT, which has one of the most prohibitively high rental markets in the country. It is a failed policy, left, right and centre.
Clear. Mike Zorbas, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.